We're all Americans. There are so many things that we can bond over.
I call it the Patriots dilemma. This love of country is getting in the way of us actually engaging with what we don't like about our country.
Dolly Chugh is a social psychologist and management professor at New York University's Stern School of Business, where she teaches MBA courses in leadership and management. Now, Dolly's research focuses on bounded ethicality, which she describes as the psychology of good people. Boy, do we need some of that, psychology of good people. In her new book, A More Just Future, Psychological Tools for Reckoning with Our Past and Driving Social Change, Dolly offers 7 tools grounded in psychological research that can help you learn and, importantly, unlearn American history. So welcome, Dolly. Congratulations on A More Just Future.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
I love the optimism of this book. I hate people that complain or criticize what's going on and don't make suggestions about how to make things better. And you don't make that mistake. You talk about what needs to happen and how we can make changes that need to be made in this world. So I love that about this book.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I like everyone else, have moments of overwhelm, but in the end, I hope we can move towards action.
I do too. I want to talk about some things that I think we get stuck on. You talk about what it means to say that our history has been whitewashed.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a lot of conversation about this, and still is a lot of conversation about this. I live half the time in Texas and some of the time in California. So I've read a lot in 2 very different environments about that. But talk about what you mean when you use that term.
And I use the term sparingly, to be honest, because I know it's a term that people struggle with. What I mean when I use it, what it refers to is that psychologically, we're all drawn to narratives that support our perspective. You know, there's a classic study in the field of psychology that took a football game that got very heated. Players were thrown out of the game. There were, some mixed emotions about different calls that were made, some unsportsmanlike conduct. And when the psychologist went and talked to the fans of both teams, this was a Princeton-Dartmouth football game, if I remember right, in the study, the fans on each side were absolutely clear that it was the other side that was unsportsmanlike and that it was their team that was the victim in this situation. And that's, I think, a situation anybody who's ever watched a sporting event can relate to, the idea that, you sort of see your team in a rosier light than you see the other team.
Right.
Whitewashing of history is in some ways nothing more than that natural impulse that we present things from our own perspective. And in the United States, we have a racial history that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, where the perspectives of people who have been enslaved or people who've been had their land removed from them are going to be different than the perspective of people who didn't have that. And so whitewashed history is referring to, is the historical perspective that we've all learned as we've grown up, that we've sort of absorbed from the culture, is it representing multiple perspectives on what happened?
I don't think you're being disloyal as an American to say, I love this country, but boy, there are a lot of things about it that I want to make better, that I want to see improve. And when you talk about being a gritty patriot, to me, that seems to be a path forward. It's saying, love your country, but have a to-do list.
Yeah. I love that. Love your country, but have a to-do list. That's great. It's a little bit like letting go of the Instagrammed version of our country, that sort of airbrushed view of it.
Yeah, exactly. There's certain parts of this country where I think civil rights progress has been almost a media phenomenon as opposed to a real world phenomenon, or it's certainly been embellished in the media versus the way it plays out in real life. Then there are other parts of the country where I think much more progress has been made. A good friend of mine, Debbie Draper, did a documentary on Black Wall Street and what happened in Tulsa. And we're working together on a project now called Freedom Georgia, a docuseries about Freedom Georgia and what the families are working on down there to create a reality. And it's astounding to me how many people in America have no idea what happened in Tulsa. It wasn't taught. They're not aware of it. When they hear about it, when they see what actually took place, are absolutely appalled.
And I was in that group until a few years ago. It was only very recently. I think it was in reading a book of fiction, actually, and I'm blanking on the author's name, but it was reading some, page turner book that had it as a historical event. This is, we know from studies by people like James Lowen, who's a historiographer. He's a historian who studies how we study history. It's kind of meta. That a lot of us, this wasn't in our textbooks, this wasn't in our classrooms. It's not our teachers' fault. No one's blaming the teachers. But again, it's where we started our conversation. There's been limited perspectives that we've been exposed to, some of us, myself included. And so, yes, when we then learn about it, there's actually a lot of disbelief. Sometimes there's feelings of shame or guilt. Sometimes the shame and guilt is about what happened. Sometimes it's about the fact that we didn't know what happened.
You talk about some psychological tools in helping people wrap their minds around this. I'm interested in talking about this because I think a lot of people misinterpret some of what I think is being asked. And I think a lot of what you are talking about here, I think a lot of people take this as a personal attack or a personal affront.
Yeah.
I did a show a few years ago on implicit bias and white privilege. White privilege, I was talking about the fact that this is something that you may have a windfall from, that you may benefit from, but it is not necessarily anything that you're doing actively, affirmatively, consciously on a day-to-day basis that you need to correct in your behavioral repertoire, but it's built in, it's systemic to our society. And I gave the example that I can walk into a department store and kind of wander around like I'm lost in the desert while my wife is shopping, and nobody follows me. Nobody bothers me. And I'm 6'4" and bald and stick out like a sore thumb. If I was me and black, that wouldn't necessarily be the case. That doesn't mean that you did anything to bring that about in this year, but that's just built in. And I had to shut off the comments on all of my social media platforms because I didn't want my viewers being exposed to some of the language that was being said in the comment sections on those media platforms for having the audacity to say that I would be afforded some privilege that a black me might not be afforded. And the things that were said, I just had to turn it off because I thought, I don't want people to have to hear some of the things being said. I always said you can't change what you don't acknowledge. And I think in this cancel culture, an awful lot of people are afraid to acknowledge something is an admission of guilt. I mean, I've had them tell me that. I've asked my audience before, because I really try to get the audience to participate, comment, ask questions. And I've asked them, how many of you today are not raising your hand because you don't want to be labeled, you don't want to cross some line, and you're self-censoring because you're
Mhm.
afraid that you're going to run a red light
Mhm.
and get labeled. It looked like the wave at a football game. Every hand in the room went up and said, I'm not saying squat, Doc. Listen, this is touchy for me. I don't have today's glossary, and it seems to change almost daily.
Yeah.
I really don't know. So to admit that I have a bias, oh my God, I'm afraid I might be applying for a job 3 years from now and somebody pull up this clip where I was in the audience and said, yeah, I admit I have some thoughts, feelings, or behaviors that I think are driven by bias, either unconsciously or otherwise, that I'm well intended, but I'm not perfect. I'm scared to death something like that might happen.
Right, right. Yeah. And so, I mean, I could be empathetic to someone not wanting to on TV kind of expose themselves. And most of us are not on TV on a regular basis the way you
Yeah, that's a
are.
tough test for
Yeah,
them. You know?
I know. But and what I tell people when they ask me about cancel culture and things like that is I say the vast majority of us, unlike Dr. Phil, are not celebrities, are not going to be canceled in the way that, when we talk about someone being canceled on a big stage, the most of us are within our communities, our families, our workplaces. We are our religious organizations. We are trying to interact with the people in our orbit. And what we know about daily interactions and interpersonal interactions is that taking ownership, apologizing sincerely, being a genuine learner, these are all things that are actually really effective in interpersonal relationships. So the idea that we would present ourselves as sort of flawless, I don't think it's believed by others. In fact, the data would suggest that, if I'm in front of a Black person, I'm not Black and I'm claiming to have no bias, I'm actually distancing myself and decreasing trust because they're unlikely to believe me as being sincere and self-aware.
I think that's true, but I think there's a difference between claiming yourself to be flawless and affirmatively acknowledging that you have biases. But I don't know. I'm here to learn. So see,
So am I.
I'll own it. I am here to learn. And one of the things you talk about is you use your research findings in part to help people how to be a better colleague to people that don't look like you, and not being a well-intentioned barrier to equality. So talk about that some. How do you be a better colleague to people that don't look like you, and not just in a high profile, but at the factory, at the university,
Yeah.
at the retail store?
Absolutely. Well, I actually think this is where what you and I were just sort of grappling with is exactly where it comes to a head. We begin with the idea of I love this rule that I learned from one of Michael Bungay-Stanier's books, the WAIT rule, the WAIT. Why am I talking rule? And here the idea is if someone tells me, and I've had this happen to me in my workplaces, someone tells me you just used a word that's inappropriate, and that's offensive, or it has a history that's problematic. My impulse in that moment, I'll be just totally transparent, is to sort of, I can feel myself get defensive, like kind of red zone defensive. I want to explain to them what a good person I am and how, mistaken they are that I would mean any harm by that. Like, in other words, I want to start talking. That's the moment where I actually, and this is where if I can go into my goodish space,
Right.
and if I can breathe for a second and use the WAIT rule, this is an opportunity for me to say, oh, maybe there's something here that I've stepped in. Whoops, that feels awful. I may have sort of done harm to someone else. That feels awful. But someone's taking the risk of telling me. Maybe I can simply say, can you tell me more? Or I didn't know that. Or I want to apologize. I didn't know that. I'm going to look into it if they don't look like they're in the mood to engage with me. The idea here is that when we're interacting with people who have different perspectives, different lived experiences, they look different than us, or they pray different than us, or they speak differently than us, these are all moments where the more we can take in a curious way, what I find I do a lot better. I build more trust with people in that mindset than when I'm in this, well, actually, you see, like I can easily go into a place of defending myself rather listening to them.
Even so, I tell people, if what I tell you won't withstand challenge, hit the eject button and go find something better, but at least consider it.
Yeah.
And if it's no good, then move on. You talk about something helping people to find their ordinary privilege, the part of your everyday identity that you take for granted. Can you expand on that for our listeners a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. First, though, I have to give you a shout out to my dad, who I think once heard you say, I forget if it's to give that every idea is a good idea for 15 minutes or 15
Oh, yeah.
seconds.
I always say, love every idea for 15 minutes.
15 minutes it is, right. And he's had to remind me of that a few times. And I've been like, Dad, you don't know what you're talking about. And so he's, well, Dr. Phil says, and so on. That gets quoted in our home a lot. And I wasn't sure if he had taken 15 seconds and turned it into 15 minutes for the Dolly modification. So ordinary privilege is so we talked about headwinds and tailwinds and how we don't always feel them. Another way is sort of, I keep, I study the things I need to work on, quite frankly. So I'm always looking for ways to understand them better so I can implement them. So this idea of headwinds and tailwinds, I'm like, well, how do I know? If I can't feel my tailwinds, how am I supposed to know I have tailwinds? So one way I've been thinking about it is, let's say we think about all the identities we hold. And so, off the top of my head, I'll just use myself. I'll say, well, I'm a woman, I'm a professor, I'm a mother, I'm Indian American, children of immigrants. Off the top of my head, those are some identities. Well, what are the identities that were not top of mind for me that I didn't even think about in that moment? One example might be is I didn't say I'm straight. Like, honestly, I don't think too much about whether or not I'm straight. I have pictures of my husband all over my office. I hold his hand in public. I refer to him, in professional settings and with my family. That freedom I have is a tailwind because some people, people from the LGBTQ community, may not feel they have that freedom in their workplace and in their families. They may not feel safe doing that in certain settings. And that, because I don't have to think about that identity, it's kind of ordinary in my life. It's just built into my day-to-day life. It's a tailwind because I don't think about it, I don't feel it the same way that somebody who has a headwind in that identity might be wrestling with it.
Right.
And so that's one way to figure out where those tailwinds are, is what's the identity that's so ordinary in my life, or ordinary in the world around me. I don't have to think about it or navigate it. And then the sort of the optimistic little scientific takeaway here is that there's research that says from multiple scholars that when let's say someone tells a racist joke, right? And let's say we take white Dr. Phil versus black Dr. Phil. You gave us those two personas earlier. If white Dr. Phil says, hey, that's not cool, to the person telling the racist joke, versus black Dr. Phil says, hey, that's not cool, what the data says is that white Dr. Phil will be taken more seriously in that situation, whereas black Dr. Phil will be viewed as perhaps having a sense of entitlement or being whiny. And it's ironic because maybe white Dr. Phil doesn't feel directly affected by that joke, whereas black Dr. Phil does. But the research says that when we're not sort of the targeted, the group that's sort of targeted in this particular issue, we're actually taken more seriously. So the optimistic scientific takeaway here is that ordinary privilege, the identities I don't think that much about, that I probably have tailwinds, that means someone else has headwinds. I also have an opportunity, instead of feeling helpless when I watch whatever unfold, that I actually have a little more influence than I thought in that identity, that maybe in that meeting I might, speak up rather than stay quiet, or in that family gathering, I might be like, I don't know if you really wanted to say it that way, rather than thinking, well, this doesn't affect me, I don't have a place in the conversation.
I did a show recently entitled You Can't Say That.
Okay.
It had a list of words that were offensive to people's sensibilities that we determined by doing a fair amount of research. And on the list was mom and dad.
Mm.
You can't say mom and dad anymore. And I was like, okay, I'm here to learn. So tell me why you can't say mom and dad anymore. And a woman in the audience said, well, at my home, we don't have a mom and a dad. We have a mom and a mom.
Right.
And it hurts our daughter's feelings to bring home a letter that says, Dear Mom and Dad. To which my first response was, you've never taken home a letter that said, Dear Mom and Dad. Show me a letter, go home, find it, send me a letter that said, Dear Mom and Dad. It always says parents. Dear parents. It doesn't say Dear Mom and Dad. Are you making a problem where one doesn't exist? And I've called my mom and dad, who are both passed away, mom and dad, for 70 years. Am I supposed to change how I refer to my parents because your nuclear family is a mom and a mom? I asked that as not a rhetorical question. It really was, are you expecting that for you to be comfortable that I change the way I refer to my deceased parents?
How did they answer?
Well, very nice lady, by the way.
Yeah.
And she said, no, not really, not personally, but I don't want my daughter to feel like she is in some way different or inferior. She said, I think that's why that's on the list.
Yeah.
I said, well, that may be why it's on the list, but I guess that's what I'm saying when some people say, is that my fight to take up? And do I need to change my life pattern because you have a daughter that's living in a mom and mom home? I think that's where people say, have we gone too far where we're spending our time working on this kind of thing when we have other battles to fight?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what I mean when I say some people say, should this be on my to-do list?
It seems improbable to me that people are asking other people to change what they call their own parents. It seems highly probable to me that in forms at the doctor's office and communications from schools, as you were referring to, in places like that, it just makes logical sense in a multi-generational world, in a world with different kinds of family structures, to just say something like adult 1, adult 2, or something like that. Like when I fill out, I will out myself here and say that when I fill out a doctor's form and it says mother's name, father's name, and I'm straight, I cross out mother and father and I write parent 1 and parent 2, or adult 1 and adult 2, for exactly the reason that it doesn't, to me, that's an easy fix. It doesn't hurt anyone. It includes more people in a world where we know there's so many different family structures. There's step families, and there's gay families, and there's grandparents raising kids. Why not create an environment, and when it's so easy to just let people fill in whoever is the appropriate parent and guardian in their home? That for me is different than saying, Dr. Phil, this is how you should refer to your deceased parents, and I am sorry that they're no longer in your life. Those seem like very different issues to me.
Yeah. And as I say, this was a delightful woman, and she said, I'm just talking about anything that someone might say that would cause my daughter to feel differently. And no, I don't expect you to change it after 70 years. So she was absolutely delightful woman and not trying to stir up trouble or whatever. But she said, this is why that's on the list. And I learned something from what she said. But I won't change how I refer to my mother and father. And she was saying, no, I want you to.
Yeah, no, agreed. And that's a good example of one where gosh, if it's, if it's not presented correctly, it sounds absurd. It just sounds ridiculous. As opposed to if it's very specific, like, can we just, on paperwork, when we're speaking to big groups of people, include all of them?
Yeah. And that was one of those situations where I thought she contributed to the conversation by making people think about, oh, well, okay, I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
Master bedroom was on the list.
Yeah.
And I knew that one, but I had someone comment on it and explained what used to happen in the master's bedroom.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, light bulbs came on over their head. And so it was a great discussion.
Yeah, that's a new one. That's one that in the course of writing A More Just Future, that's where that one came to my awareness. And I understand in the real estate industry, there's been some shifting of vocabulary. I have to confess, I still can't, the word master bedroom comes out of my mouth. Like, if I'm saying, oh, we need to repair the air conditioner in the master bedroom, I'm like, oh, so it's a process. Yeah.
Habits are hard to change. That's why I say you can remind yourself, or someone could gently remind you instead of attack you about it, which sometimes happens.
Yes.
But I love your concept of a goodish person versus a good person, because that means we're all works in progress, right?
Exactly.
It means we're all growing and changing, and we don't have to meet some absolute standard. A More Just Future. The subtitle is Psychological Tools for Reckoning with Our Past and Driving Social Change. You make so much sense. The book is broken into 3 parts. How do we start? What do we do? Where do we go from here? And where do we go from here has 2 chapters in it that are entitled Take Responsibility and Build Grit. Boy, it just makes so much sense. The way you talk about this, it makes it really hard for people to be threatened rather than inspired, and to not take these messages really aspirational, things that you really want to aspire to. And that's why I started this whole thing by saying the optimism in your book, absent the judgment and not with naive optimism, but just saying, look, this is doable. We can make things better. We can create social change, is so true. This book should be required reading for every young person in high school. It should be required reading for all 435 representatives in the House and all 100 senators in the Senate. And I'll buy copies and send them to every one of them if they'll read it.
Oh my goodness.
It would be so important. It's a point of view. It's an approach that can't not bring about change because it takes away the threat and the defensive-ness.
I'm blushing, Dr. Will. Thank you so much. I feel like you've seen and felt my intent, which is I set out to write a book that leaves the reader hopeful and resilient and with a path forward, using stories and science and fueled by my love of country. Thank you for seeing that.
Well, I do see it and I do feel it. I love chapter 5. I have to say it was one of my favorite chapters in the whole thing. Like I say, I started with the underside of American history in 1968, and then to read about these fables here, really interesting. I just think people will love this book, and I really hope people will pick this up and read it. I promise you, you'll be glad you did, and you can write me and tell me I lied if you don't, because I'll take that risk. But I stand by it. It's an excellent book. I would love to have you on the show to talk about some of these things when we talk about how to bring about change and how to close up the divisiveness in the country. I think you're a thought leader in this, Dolly. I really do. I think you're a thought leader in how to close the gap in the divisiveness in this country right now.
I'm honored, and it would be my honor.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. I really do look forward to talking to you again, and you're a better historian than you give yourself credit for. excellent psychologist, but a pretty damn good historian as well. And tell your dad he's a wise man. That's all I can say.
There you go. There you go. My mom and dad are the best. Thank you for that acknowledgement.
Listen, thank you so much, and I look forward to talking again soon.
I can't wait. Thanks, Dr. Phil.
Again, the book is A More Just Future by Dolly Chugh, Psychological Tools for Reckoning with Our Past and Driving Social Change, and it is spectacular, so I highly recommend it. That's it for today. Thanks, everyone.